Just a quick note before we begin, I have lots of class resources available for you all. If you're on an iPad, you can find the link to the class resources on my first post in the discussion section. If you're on a computer, you can find these resources in the Your Project section. That said, let's begin. I started this drawing with a grid, quickly massing in the shapes of color. But really quickly in the process, I realized that the difficult angle and tilt of the head were going to be a problem for me, so I knew I had to lean on my drawing skills a bit to properly construct her. So I restarted, tackling this painting with a new approach since my first method just wasn't working out for me for this particular piece. I think different pieces can call for different processes, and you'll see this throughout my demos. I typically don't paint with a grid, but I found that it made the process of capturing accurate proportions much simpler. So I wanted to show you this way of mapping out your drawing. I would say to not use a grid as a crutch though. Try to practice and develop your drawing skills with and without a grid. When I do use a grid, I like to keep the grid squares quite big. Too many squares for me would just be too overwhelming. And it would also make me go too much into copy mode, and I would stop thinking about concepts and forms and bigger ideas. When I place my grid, I like to anchor the edges of the rectangles at important landmarks. Here I place the edges of the main rectangle at her brow edge and at the bottom of her nose. That helps me place these important features more easily, because I know that they're just right on that edge. At this point, this is what my layers look like. Super simple. There's the photograph, my painting, and then the grid layer on top, which I can turn on and off as I wish. I personally like to keep my layers super simple like this. Too many layers tends to confuse me. And I also like the feel of working on one layer, with all the strokes interacting with their surrounding strokes. It feels more natural to me, like I'm working with a traditional medium. So this is my preference, but use as many or as few layers as you want. Do whatever works for you. For this portion of the piece, I'm pretty much just using the 6B sketching pencil. Sometimes using the point of the Apple Pencil, and sometimes turning it on its side to get a nice thick stroke. Drawing portraits is a difficult thing to do, so go into this knowing that it might be a challenge. You have to get miles of canvas behind you with practice before it will become simple. If you'd like a really in-depth lesson on drawing portraits, check out my pencil portrait class. There we'll cover the needed basics of proportions and structure. I struggled with the details of this earring. To be honest, I wasn't in love with the look of it, and I didn't want to put in all the effort I knew it would take. So I took it out, and that's fine. As artists, we have the liberty to put things in that aren't there, and to also take things out that are. I also experimented with the idea of giving her a hairpiece. But in the end, I decided to just keep it simple. I added a couple oil paint strokes for some textural interest. I may add an accessory to this one eventually. That's one of the cool and unique things about digital painting. I can have this version, and I can also copy it later and make another version if I want to. If you took my female character drawing class, then you know all about how to draw a character like this. The cool thing is, the process transfers over to this medium really well. Using the 6B pencil, I sketch out my girl. I can feel totally free to experiment with her hair, expression, and accessories because pressing the undo button is so simple. Once I'm happy with the basic sketch, I add a new layer and put it under my sketch layer. Then I just pick colors like I would if I were coloring in a coloring book. Since my line work is on a separate layer, I can even change the color of the lines from the brown I initially chose to this purpley pink. On the color layer, I can add this orangey glow with a large soft brush. I love getting this harmonizing look. With an eraser brush, I can erase anywhere I went outside the boundaries of my line work. Now I have a cute little character. I found this man to have a really interesting look. I decided to sketch him in roughly to start. Once I had the basics laid out, I went in and started massing in shapes. The image is in black and white, so we're only working with values here. I try to think about the lighting situation so that I can make good value decisions and render the form of his face effectively. I try to mix soft and hard edges, using the soft brush for the softness and the 6B brush for harder edges in comparison. I also dropped straight horizontal lines to get the forehead, brow line, nose, and chin placed in proper relationship. I struggled with putting in too many details on his face too quickly. I had to pull myself back sometimes. It's better to have good believable forms in place first and then put detail in on top. It's like icing a cake. You can't ice a cake before you've even pulled it out of the oven. And so it's the same with painting, I believe. You have to get the solid, big structures in first, and then add detail only once your forms are in place. I think I could have made this portrait better if I'd really honed in on that idea and not rushed into detail. With this drawing, I wanted to try out a new charcoal brush set I made, so I wasn't focused on the likeness at all. I just wanted the pose as reference. I started with a simple sketch, imagining her head as a ball with a jaw. After putting in some basic line work, I went in with one of my big charcoal brushes and got some values up there on the canvas to work with. Then with a kneaded eraser brush I made, I erased out some of the tones. I tried to approach this like I would a real charcoal drawing. That's one of the coolest things about Procreate. The brushes feel so real. This drawing is just a big experiment, but I'll have my charcoal set available on Gumroad soon, so look out for that if you'd like to try it. Or like I said, make your own brushes. I actually got out my real materials to make these. I just made different shapes with the charcoal dust and smudges, took some photos, and turned them into charcoal brushes. I painted this portrait on a boat with my family while we were watching a movie. That's another reason why I love Procreate and the iPad Pro so much. You can paint anywhere. I used a grid because I just wanted to get to where I was going quickly so I could get into the fun of painting. I masked in the painting with a soft brush, experimented with some brushes, and then landed in on my favorite 6B. This was my first Procreate portrait. I painted the piece in one layer, painting by instinct, and frankly, pretty sloppily. But that's sometimes the fun of it, being loose and expressive. I find that areas like this are worth grabbing onto. Getting in warm, crisp cast shadows like this will start to make your subject look 3D. I like finding little areas like this. They give a piece an impressive look while being super simple to do. Looking at the negative spaces in this piece really helped me draw it too. Instead of looking at the nose shape, I looked at this gray shape. I absolutely love the headscarf in this photo. It's always inspired me. Plus she's a beauty and the color palette is just gorgeous to me too, so I just had to paint her. First I planted everything in place using a soft brush. It's actually kind of scribbly and messy as I get to know what I'm looking at. I'm constantly looking at positive and negative spaces to get these things in place. Once I have the basics, I go in with my 6B, and I sort of start to carve out the forms like a sculptor would. She stayed in this phase without a mouth for quite a while, because I knew that the underlying forms of her mouth weren't ready for lips yet. If I'd put the lips on right away, all the forms around her mouth would have looked flat. So I took the time to sculpt this area. So forgive me for how creepy she looks right now. Finally, the surrounding forms are ready for lips, so I put them in place. I found that I was able to build up the face by working in a small value range, with incremental value changes. I also used the technique where I drew small lines with my 6B around forms to give them push and direction.